Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for your continued support. Today, I will finally get around to covering the Guardian from the new Battlecry book. Now, Battlecry is already out on Archives of Nethys, so all of you can go ahead and read it online, but I still wanted to share my review of the class and how it performs, and spoiler alert, I think the Guardian might be the best tank in the game now. If you're interested in my opinions on the commander, make sure to check out that video linked above. Before we dig into the Guardian though, I wanted to talk a little bit about Magic Plus. Now Magic Plus is the newest book released by Team Plus. I have talked about Team Plus before when I was talking about Wizard Plus, the book where they add a bunch of stuff to make the Wizard class a little bit spicier and a lot more fun for players who don't like the Wizard as is. Magic Plus aims to do that for spellcasting as a whole, and spellcasters as a whole. It has tons of new spells. It has tools to make 1-action and 3-action versions of a variety of spells that currently only exist as 2-action spells. It has new spellcasting archetypes and an Archmage Mythic Destiny. It even has revamped versions of summon spells and battle form spells for those who are a little unsatisfied with how those work raw. But most of all, it has one of my favorite subsystems called Essence Casting. I got a chance to playtest this during their playtest process for Magic Plus, and it works astoundingly well. You can see it in action over on Arcane Mark's channel, where they go through Dawnsbury Days with the Essence Casting mod, but the short of it is that rather than using resources that get expended throughout the day for your spells, you will instead build up resources over the course of turns of combat and cast more and more powerful spells throughout the combat. These spells are then not limited throughout the day. You can cast an unlimited number of maximum rank spells, provided you build to them during the course of a combat first. This subsystem was a lot of fun to play with during playtest, and I may release a whole video talking about the subsystem in detail, including tactics of how and when to use certain spells. For now though, make sure to check out Magic Plus. There is a link in the description that you can use to get a discount code to buy the book. Finally, a teensy bit of housekeeping before we talk about the Guardian. Make sure to check out my video that generally talks about tanking before we look at the Guardian today. The very nature of the Guardian class is going to draw comparisons to the Champion, and these comparisons are predicated on the assumption that the Champion is sort of the default and only way of tanking in Pathfinder before the Guardian comes out. I want to make sure that we're on the same page, that that's not the case, that there are many good tanks in Pathfinder as of now, and the Guardian is just another one of those very good tanks, although potentially the best of them. So if you've already seen that previous video, let's get into talking about the Guardian in detail. Let's talk about the general class chassis, the numbers and the flavor that the Guardian is going for. Thematically, you are supposed to be an impossible to ignore brick wall. You are not the best at dealing damage to others, but you are capable of just walling off your friends and forcing the enemies to deal with you, and making sure your friends get as much uptime as possible on what they want to do. And in my opinion, the Guardian class delivers excellently on this by just looking at the way the numbers progress. Offensively, you have somewhat weak progression compared to other martials. While your proficiency and class DC scaling are standard, you'll get your weapon proficiency at levels 1, 5, and 13 like any other martial, your weapon specialization, the thing that lets you do baseline damage, is a little delayed compared to other martials. You get it at level 11 rather than level 7 like most martials do, and your improvement to it, greater weapon specialization, happens at level 17 rather than level 15. But the trade-off for this is that defensively, you are way stronger than any other martial class. The Champion and the Monk are pretty much the only ones that approach you in terms of defenses, and I would say overall the Guardian is still ahead. Your armor proficiency goes all the way to legendary, and it does so faster than anyone else. It does so faster than a Champion too. Your armor is level 1 trained, level 5 expert, level 11 master, and level 15 legendary, which is a staggeringly fast progression. On top of that, you have a passive physical resist equal to 1 plus half your level right from the get-go at level 1 all the way to level 20. This scales with you, and it scales better than armor specialization naturally does. Remember that armor specialization will typically give you a smaller resistance than 1 plus half your level, and only to a subset of the damage types you can take out of the 3 physical damage types. This does it to all the physical damage types. This passive physical resist is a huge portion of why the Guardian is so survivable. Now your save proficiency ends up at Master in Fortitude and Master in Will, and it ends up at Expert in Reflex. So you have a similar distribution as the Champion, 2 Master and 1 Expert, and this is worse than the Monk. Notably though, your progression is a little better than the Champion's because your class is innately full of more ways of mitigating bad reflex than a Champion is. You'll notice this when you look at some of the class features you have, some of the feats you have. Your mediocre reflex is not going to be as much of a problem for you as it will be for a Champion. And one of the big reasons for this is actually the next point. You are a 12 HP per level class. You have the same amount of HP as a Barbarian on top of having that passive physical resist that the Barbarian doesn't have to all the damage types. They usually only get it to a couple damage types at best. So all in all, you will be an incredibly survivable tank. You have the best HP in the game, tied with the Barbarian. You have the best AC in the game, tied with no one. And you have good saves. You have good martial level saves. They're not going to be as good as a monk, but martials still tend to have baseline good saves. And on top of that, you have passive resistance to all physical damage, and you have a bunch of defensively oriented class features and feats that we'll get into. Your only option for your key attribute is strength, which makes a lot of thematic sense for the Guardian, and you'll probably want heavy armor or armor that's on the heavier side of medium anyway, so this just tracks for you. And finally, you have 2 defining class features, Taunt and Intercept Attack. These are the tools which will help you make yourself sticky. Remember, you are amazing defensively, but your offenses are not quite there. So if you had nothing else aside from good defenses, there would be no reason for your enemies to be attacking you. But Taunt and Intercept Attack are your cornerstone features that'll make sure that you will remain a problem that enemies are forced to deal with. This is how the Guardian generates the dilemma that I was talking about in my previous video when I mentioned that tanks in Pathfinder like to create dilemmas for their enemies that force them to attack the tank, which is not a good option either. So now we'll be talking about the tanking toolkit of the Guardian. Just a note that during the playtest, this toolkit was not nearly as synergistic or powerful as it is now. Taunt was a much weaker option in the playtest, where by default it actually made you easier to hit rather than your allies harder to hit. Back then, the Guardian was also not a 12 HP class, they were a 10 HP class, and that meant that you were not all that survivable either. So Taunt has come a long way from the playtest, and it's a much better option now. The way it works is simple. You spend 1 action, and then you choose an enemy within 30 feet of you. This can even be a mindless enemy. There's no mental trait attached to this option. And that enemy now has a -1 circumstance penalty to any attack rolls or DCs for any action they take that is hostile towards your friends without also being hostile towards you. That wording means, for example, that if you position yourself across from your party from a dragon, it can try to breath weapon all of your friends or just you. And if it chooses to breath weapon all of your friends, it actually has a -1 to its DC. That's the reason that feature is worded that way. The taunted enemy also becomes off guard if they choose to ignore you for one of their hostile actions and attack one of your friends. So not only do they have a -1 to the attack roll or the saving throw DC that they attack their friends with, but then after that, they're off guard to you. Now, off guard by itself in a vacuum is a cheap condition. It's very easy to inflict off guard, especially if you're a melee character, and a Guardian tank is almost always going to be melee, but the Guardian has a lot of feats, some of which I'll get into, that key off of this off guard. When an enemy is off guard specifically due to being taunted and ignoring you, you can get significantly stronger action economy, damage, and crowd control options against them. There are also feats that upgrade the distance of your taunt or the number of targets you can taunt at once. There are feats that compress taunts onto strikes. So taunting is a core and powerful part of the Guardian toolkit that you can use feats to deepen or broaden as you like. The next part of the Guardian toolkit that is, in my opinion, the thing that really makes the Guardian amazing is Intercept Attack. This is something that's both a lot more flashy and, in my opinion, a lot more powerful than the Taunt. Taunt is ultimately just a one-action debuff to attacking your friends, and then some follow-up punishments that you can deliver, but it's not directly protecting your friends too much. Chances are that even with that -1 debuff, your friends are a much better target to attack than you anyways, because you have the highest AC in the game and you still have good saves and you have 12 HP, right? So even when an enemy's taunted, they're often going to ignore you. Intercept Attack is how you simply say no to that. If an ally within 10 feet of you takes physical damage, you can step closer to that ally as part of this reaction, and then simply eat that damage. If the enemy that was delivering this damage to your ally was taunted by you previously, then you can actually do this within 15 feet and a stride rather than 10 feet and a step. Now, in my previous video, I talked a little bit about why Intercept Attack is so good, but I will be getting even more in depth about it from the next slide onwards, so just hold off on that. For now, take my word for it that Intercept Attack is incredibly good, even if you may not think so at first. And finally, the Guardian gets some core class features that make sure that it's very likely to have Intercept Attack available. First, you have a feature that makes sure that you will always have a reaction. Most of the time, you're not supposed to have reaction in the first turn of combat until you've had a turn, but the Guardian will always have their reaction. This reaction can only be used on Guardian feats and class features, but your most powerful reactions are going to be Intercept Attack, which is a Guardian class feature, and some of the other Guardian feats you take. And then at level 7, you get a second reaction for free. You don't have to spend a feat on this like a lot of other classes do to get additional reactions. You just have this additional reaction built in, and you can use this only for Guardian feats or class features. So now you can have 2 Intercept Attacks per round once you're at level 7. That's an incredible amount of value to have on your character, and this means that as a tank, you don't really offer the GM a choice. All other tanks in the game, they offer the GM a choice. The goal is to then make the choices as bad as possible. A champion will offer the GM the choice between hit my friend and have that damage reduced, or hit me and I am too hard to hit. An athletics tank would make it really action intensive to hit their friends. A healing tank will heal up the damage that their friends take. The Guardian does not offer a choice. The Guardian says, if you try to hit my friends, I'm simply going to say, nope, you're hitting me. And that, in my opinion, is what makes the Guardian so cool and so powerful. Now, to explain why Intercept Attack is so good, I wanted to demonstrate using a practical combat example. Before anyone says that this example is cherry-picked, yes, it is cherry-picked. I specifically chose an example to showcase when and why the Guardian is good. Remember, my argument here is not to say that the Guardian is far and away the only tanking option, and that the champion sucks, and the Warp Race Cleric sucks, and everything else sucks. The point here is that the Guardian is a good or great tanking option, and then the champion is also a good or great tanking option, and so is the Warp Race Cleric, and so are the other good tanks I talked about in a previous video. There are going to be situations where the Guardian is better than the champion. There are going to be situations where the champion is better than the Guardian. That is the nature of the game. Different contexts, different party compositions, different terrains, different enemy compositions, and different secondary objectives all can change the texture of what makes one tank better than another. But overall, I think the Guardian makes for an amazing tank, and I want to show this using this example explaining why Intercept Attack is so good. So this is going to be a fight between a level 6 party and a level 9 single boss. Specifically, the boss is going to be a young Sky Dragon. Now, I chose the Sky Dragon on purpose. Dragons in general tend to have very high versatility compared to monsters of the same level. The amount of versatility a dragon brings to the table is sometimes what you would expect from 2 or 3 uniquely synergistic stat blocks coming to the table at once. Single bosses don't tend to have this degree of versatility, but conversely, when they do, when you're fighting an enemy that's like a Sky Dragon or a Lesser Death or a Gug or something along those lines, that's when your party is most at risk. So that's when evaluating your tanking strategy is at its most important. If you want to pause and read the stat block in detail, feel free to. I'm going to go through a Cliff Notes version where I don't talk about all of their abilities. For starters, this dragon has a 120-foot flying speed. It can also hover. It does not need to spend an action to stay flying. This means that it can get to where it wants on pretty much any battlefield you're going to fight in. This makes your job as a tank exceptionally hard. If it wants to focus fire and ally, it's going to get to do so. We'll ignore some of the passives like Misvision and the defenses like Countered by Fire, Fed by Earth, and Frightful Presence because they don't really impact what's going on in this scenario that we're talking about, neither do the AC or saving throws or immunities. Now, this dragon has 3 attacks: Jaws, Claw, and Tail. And each of these have a different texture of damage and traits. So the averages are as follows. The Claw and the Tail will both deal 21 damage on a hit, 42 on a crit. The Jaw deals a little bit more than that, 27.5 on a hit and 55 on a crit, a pretty monstrous gap here. The Jaws is the standard attack. It's got a 10-foot reach and no unique traits. Claw and Tail both have the Grab additional action. The way Grab works is that the dragon is allowed to spend an extra action after hitting to make an athletics check that neither counts nor contributes to multiple attack penalty. Now, the Claw and Tail have identical damage and Grab, but where they differ is that the Claw has a 5-foot reach, but it has the Agile trait, which makes it really good for follow-up attacks. And then the Tail has an exceptionally long 20-foot reach. That's why it does less damage than the Jaws. So you can see that this toolbox of attacks is already incredibly versatile, but that's not where it stops. The dragon also has a breath weapon. This breath weapon is a 20-foot burst that deals electricity damage, which means it's a fireball-sized burst, although with a much shorter range than fireball. It has Coiling Frenzy, which is a specialized version of the Draconic Frenzy, which forces it to choose the same target, but if either of the 2 strikes it makes hits, it will automatically grab the target without needing to spend an additional action. Finally, it has the Constrict action, where it can use a basic Fortitude saving throw to inflict some damage on an enemy that it has already grabbed. So this is a way for it to maplessly deal damage whenever needed. All of these factors will impact your tanking decisions, which we'll get into on the following slides. But first, let's look at what HP looks like for a level 6 party, because I think looking at this HP is really going to put into context why Intercept Attack is so good. So I'm assuming the party looks like Wizard, Cleric, and Rogue. I'm effectively going for Ezran, Kyra, and Merisiel, the Iconics. And then I'm assuming the 4th character is a tank. We're going to use Irabeth, the Guardian iconic, as the Guardian example, but we're also going to compare it to what if Irabeth was a champion instead. So the Wizard at this level, Ezran, has 56 HP most likely. Now, these HP numbers are not just from your class and ancestry. I have also made some assumptions on things like Constitution modifiers and whether you took the Toughness feat or not. The Wizard worked out to having 56 HP. That is what Ezran's HP is going to look like. The Cleric, Kyra, worked out at 68 HP. The Rogue, Merisiel, worked out at 74 HP. Not that much more than a Cleric, because remember, Rogues are an 8 HP class. And then your tank, if it's a champion, they're going to have 92 HP. And if it's a Guardian, they're going to have 104 HP. So you can see here that the Guardian has about twice as much HP as the Wizard. And this is going to be a huge part of why Intercept Attack is so good. Now let's put all of that on a battle map and figure out how this plays out in practice. This is what the battle map will look like. Ignore the coloration I gave to the player's tokens for a moment. It'll make sense after I start talking about the dragon's tactics. The dragon is the large token near the north of the map. Merisiel, the rogue, is directly north of the dragon. Irabeth, the tank, be it champion or guardian, is directly south of the dragon. Kyra is a little to the southeast of Irabeth, and Ezran is really far to the southwest of Kyra. I put 2 measurements to put into perspective how the party is positioned. Kyra is 30 feet away from Merisiel. This is intentional because Kyra would want to potentially cast a heal spell if Merisiel feels threatened. Likewise, this way, Erebeth is covering both Merisiel and Kyra with her 15-foot aura, be it Champion Aura or Intercept Attack, given that she would have taunted this dragon. Ezrin is 50 feet away from Kyra so that a breath weapon cannot possibly catch both of them. The breath weapon would have a 40-foot diameter, and thus it wouldn't be able to catch both of them in the same breath weapon. Now, just a note here, Erebeth is a Jotunborn, and she would obviously be large. I simply did not consider that while making this example because in my head, I made this example with a generic guardian or champion. So let's just pretend she is a medium-sized 10 HP ancestry rather than the Jotunborn. Now let's get into those colors. They are my way of denoting the dragon's strategy. If I, as a GM, want to play this dragon in an intentional and tactical way to present a real challenge to the players, not just the veneer of the challenge, but a real plausible challenge, these are the tactics I would use. First, in green are what I consider the best tactics for the dragon to consider. Those being either focus on Kyra or focus on Merisiel. Both of them are significantly squishier than Erebeth, of course, and both of them are high-value targets. Kyra is the party's healer. Merisiel is the party's damage dealer. Getting Kyra into a bad position means no heals for the party, and getting Merisiel into a bad position means you might effectively take Merisiel and Kyra out of combat for a turn or two, because Kyra is forced to heal Merisiel so the party can catch back up in damage. An intelligent dragon would probably figure out right on turn 1 that the holy character is the healer, so I think that would be the higher priority target. But Merisiel would also be a really high priority target once the dragon knows what she's capable of. So the 4 optimal options here are strike plus grab Kyra with its long tail and then potentially constrict after, or fire off a breath weapon at Kyra and Erebeth to spread the damage a little and then focus on Kyra. Those are the 2 that focus on Kyra, and then the 2 options to focus on Merisiel are using Coiling Frenzy on Merisiel to do a bunch of damage and grab her, or use Jaws followed by Claw attacks on Merisiel and try to get that high roll where you just get Merisiel down right away on your first turn off crits and hits. These are all good options for the dragon to consider. Then Ezrin is in yellow because he's still a decent target, but not as good as Kyra or Merisiel. The dragon can still do a fine job threatening the party by getting to Ezrin. It can fly over with a single action, and notably, it would probably take the party's melee's 2 or 3 actions to then catch up to this dragon if it's positioned properly, and it will still have 2 actions left to threaten Ezrin with, perhaps using a strike followed by a grab, or perhaps just Jaws plus Claw, because Ezrin is so squishy. And finally, there's the really bad option, highlighted in red, focusing Erebeth. This is something I alluded to in both my previous video and throughout this video. A tank that isn't able to convince enemies to focus it isn't tanking at all, because you'll just be ignored. You're too hard a target to really focus down. Erebeth is too chunky and too hard to hit, and thus not a priority target unless she does something about it. So by default, assuming Erebeth does nothing, how much pressure is this dragon putting on the party? A lot. If Kyra was focused with strike plus grab with the tail, and both of those crit, which isn't that hard to believe because this dragon is 3 levels above the party, she would drop to 26 out of 68 HP and be restrained. So she would immediately be in a range where she would normally consider healing herself, and she'd be unable to heal herself. If instead of going for the strike plus grab, the dragon tried directly focusing more damage on Kyra, she could be in an even worse situation. Merisiel would be in a similarly bad place with Focus Fire. If the dragon chose to use Jaw plus Claw at Merisiel and does a crit followed by a regular hit, she's most likely going to be unconscious. If the dragon instead used Coiling Frenzy, she would be fairly unlikely to be unconscious, but she'd be at really low health if there was a crit followed by a hit, and she'd be grabbed. So regardless of which option the dragon uses, Merisiel is definitely going to need healing. And some of the time, she won't just need healing, she will actually be flat out unconscious. Remember, Kyra needs to spend 2 actions to heal Merisiel. This is going to happen either way if Merisiel got focus fired, but if Merisiel dropped unconscious, she will then spend 2 additional actions, 1 to stand up, 1 to pick up her weapon. This sort of action economy problem is how death spirals start. And notably, if Mauricio is left in the low HP range, the average of 13 out of 76 HP she would have after a Coiling Frenzy, if we assume crit followed by hit, a Constrict can relatively easily finish Mauricio off from 13 HP, and it does not have the multiple attack penalty. So since Coiling Frenzy can grab just as part of the action being taken rather than needing an additional action, Mauricio is actually at a pretty decent risk of being unconscious right at the first turn of combat. And finally, if the dragon flew over to Ezrein and just strike plus grab, Ezrein would be in a horrible spot too. So what can the tanks do about it? We will first start by looking at the champion. So what can the tank do about this? What can the tank do to ensure that this really deadly boss doesn't just instantly cause a death spiral on turn 1? We're assuming that Erebeth, the tank, is a champion, and that is going to change the dragon's tactical targeting to this. So what does the champion do here? First, I'm assuming the champion is going to knock the dragon prone, because you need to get the dragon's insane amount of mobility under control. If Erebeth herself doesn't do this, somebody else is probably going to try and do it anyways. Maybe a spell like Slow would be cast to make sure the dragon doesn't have its third action. Either way, you would try to deny the dragon an action so it's hard for it to fly around and pick its targets as it likes. And of course, the champion will be threatening the champion's reaction in a 15-foot aura. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that this is the Redeemer champion's reaction. I will talk about other subclasses at the end of this slide, but let's assume Redeemer for now. How does all of this impact the dragon's strategy? First, I wanted to highlight that Ezrein got demoted as a target all the way to red. In a vacuum, he was a yellow target. He's been demoted to red because now it takes 2 actions to get to Ezrein. And yes, the third action might still just knock Ezrein to unconscious right away because a crit deals an average of 55 damage if it comes from the dragon's jaws, and Ezrein has 56 HP, so around 45% of the time you should expect a crit to just knock Ezrein out. But the dragon wouldn't know this. The dragon doesn't know Ezrein's HP pool. It could probably guess that Ezrein is the squishiest of the lot, but it wouldn't gamble on Ezrein being so squishy that a single crit would take him out. And Ezrein might have other tools to protect himself too. False Vitality, Hidebound, wouldn't double. So the dragon is unlikely to want to stand up, fly over, and gamble on just taking Ezrein out like that. So Ezrein has been demoted in targeting all the way to being as bad as Erebeth. Now, Kyra also got demoted. She used to be green, an optimal target. She's gone down to yellow, which is a decent target, and Mauricio has not changed at all. Why is that? Let's look at the amount of pressure the dragon is able to put out, and we'll see why Mauricio did not get demoted at all and why Kyra is still a decent target. So first, the champion's reaction is going to do a good job of protecting Kyra. On the previous slide, I noted that after a crit, Kyra would drop to about 1/3 of her HP and desperately need healing. The champion's reaction would make it so she drops a little under half, which is a bad place to be, but not the worst. And if you don't get crit, like if you get a little lucky and don't get crit, you're actually just fine. And then if the dragon wanted to make a second attack rather than attempt to grab, it would have the enfeebled condition, making it likelier to miss and deal less damage on a hit. So Kyra is most likely going to be in a fine spot. That being said, she can still be grabbed. Now, I assumed Redeemer here. If Erebeth was a Liberator champion, Kyra would just step out of there, and then she couldn't be grabbed, and she couldn't be follow-up hit either. But all that being said, a champion would do a fine job protecting Kyra here. Liberator would do a better job than any of the other causes. But despite doing a good job of protecting Kyra, Mauricio is not the most protected. Yes, she's in a better spot than she would be if Erebeth were not a champion, but Mauricio is still the priority target and still a very good target for the dragon. The way the champion's resistance works is that if the dragon did Jaw followed by Claw, the champion would effectively give 16 damage reduction rather than 8 to Mauricio on that first crit, because the Jaw has 2 damage types, one being electricity and the other being piercing. We are assuming for simplicity that it wasn't a super low roll on electricity and then a super high roll on piercing, but that's besides the point. So Mauricio is very unlikely to just go unconscious from Jaw plus Claw, And likewise, if she was Coiling Frenzied, she would be at a little higher HP than she would have been on the previous slide. In this case, you're not doubling the resistance because there's only one damage type. And then the Enfeebled would weaken the damage of the second attack to land on Mauricio. That being said, 16 to 25 HP is not a good range to be for a rogue. She would almost certainly need healing. So all the champion did is take away that horrible outcome where Mauricio goes down right away on turn 1, but Mauricio's still very likely to be in a bad spot and need Kyra to heal her. You're still going to have Kyra needing to spend 2 actions healing Mauricio. And of course, this is assuming the Sky Dragon stands up and then attacks Mauricio. There is a chance that the Sky Dragon just takes the gamble on staying prone, making 3 attacks against Mauricio, and yes, it has a -2 to those attacks, but if it hits all 3, Mauricio might still go unconscious. And this is a boss enemy that is 3 levels above the party, so if it decides to focus all of its attacks on Mauricio without standing up, that -2 and even the -8 on that final attack with a multiple attack penalty, it might still hit. It's unlikely to, but if it does, it's going to be horrible for the party. So there's a lot of pressure going around, and Mauricio is still going to need healing. The champion did a good job protecting Kyra, but Mauricio is ultimately only being saved from the worst case outcome. She's still in a pretty bad spot. So all of that looks pretty bleak. How would the Guardian have fared in this somewhat worst case example that we set up? This is what I think the battle map will end up looking like if Erebeth were a Guardian rather than a champion. And if you can see from the colors, I think the Guardian is going to fare a lot better. So to talk about Erebeth's strategy, just like before, she's going to try to knock the dragon prone to make sure Ezrein is not a good target. If she fails at that, then someone's going to try to cast slow on the dragon. If that slow also fails, it might spell disaster for Ezrein. He may have to close the gap with the party so Erebeth can protect him directly. That's just the nature of how things evolve in Pathfinder. But let's assume that the party has successfully denied the dragon one action via prone or slow. Now on top of this, Erebeth has Taunt and Intercept Attack. Now the first part of Taunt is a -1 penalty to attack anyone who is not Erebeth. Let's ignore that for now, because this is actually somewhere where the champion had the advantage. Erebeth over here would give a -1 to the dragon to attack her friends. But on the previous slide, Erebeth could have cast Shields of the Spirit and given everyone a +1 to AC. And then on top of that, when she used her reaction, Enfeebled would have inflicted a further -2 to the dragon's follow-up attacks, not to all of his attacks, but to perhaps half of its attacks. Taunt -1, while it's good, is actually not as good as what the champion could have done to directly reduce the enemy's odds of critting or hitting. Let's note that before we assume that the enemy's gonna crit or hit anyways, because this is sort of talking about what the Guardian and champion can do when things start going wrong. That is where Intercept Attack comes in. Now remember, Taunt will increase Intercept Attack's range to 15 feet, which means both Mauricio and Kyra are protected. What does this do to the dragon's strategy? Well, the gist of it is the dragon has no good targets left. As we talked about in the previous slide, Ezrein and Erebeth remain horrible targets. That has not changed. Kyra has now become a much worse target, and Mauricio is now a decent target, but because she is only a decent target rather than an optimal one, it's gonna make everyone else's job of protecting Mauricio and healing Mauricio much easier. So to understand why the targeting has become so bad for the dragon, let's look at how much pressure it's able to put out. First, let's look at Mauricio. On the previous slide, the dragon got the choice to focus fire Mauricio, and Mauricio was probably going to end up at 16 to 25 HP after all things said and done, including the champion's mitigation of that damage. But the Guardian takes away that choice entirely. Mauricio is not going to go down to below 1/3 of her health like she did on the previous slide. Let's say it's a crit followed by a hit. Erebeth will block the crit and take that damage to herself, and then Mauricio will just take damage from the hit, so she's probably at 55 or so HP. Erebeth will take a huge chunk of damage, say 55 average if it was from Jaws and 42 average from one of the other weapons. That'll be reduced by -4 because of the Guardian's inherent physical resist, but because the Guardian has 104 HP, she's gonna be fine. She's gonna be at 53 to 66 HP, about as much as where Mauricio is. Neither of them got focus fired, neither of them is feeling particularly pressured. And notably, there's a degree of flexibility here. Let's say the first attack was not a crit. Let's say it just hit. Erebeth just doesn't have to block it. And then if the second attack is a high roll of a hit or just a crit, like a lucky natural 20, Erebeth can block that. Erebeth always has the choice on how to redirect damage if and when needed. The way I like to look at it is that the champion mitigates the first hit or crit that her ally takes, but the guardian redirects fully and unconditionally the worst hit that ally would have taken. Not the first one, the worst one. If things are going well, if no crits happened and it was something more like hit, miss, and then hit on a really weak roll or something, you might not even bother with Intercept Attack. But when things are going wrong, when your friends are getting crit, you'll just redirect it and take the pressure off the party. And for many of the same reasons as Mauricio, Kyra is also not a worthwhile target. First off, she can't be grabbed. Erebeth ate all the damage from the attack, and thus you can't use a follow-up grab on Kyra. Just a note that I'm not 100% confident on the wording of Intercept Attack and whether it would let you block grab like that, but I think most GMs would rule it that way because the feature is all about throwing yourself fully in harm's way and it lets you block all the damage your friend takes, so I would say that the dragon can't follow-up grab Kyra either. And Kyra can't be focus fired because Erebeth ate an attack for her. And of course, there's always the option of focusing Erebeth, but that was innately a bad option. It doesn't matter that Erebeth only has like 50 to 60 HP left, she still has the highest AC on the battlefield, she still has physical resist, she might have options like shield block or raise haft and other such stuff involved to make her even worse of a target. So once Erebeth has intercepted the dragon's attack, it's not like the dragon can just say, okay, well, I will focus you now. Let's say the dragon crit Mauricio with the first attack. Erebeth blocks that. The dragon would probably still want to attack Mauricio because Erebeth is too hard a target to threaten with an attack that has a multiple attack penalty on it. So all in all, the dragon will just never have good targets. And this means that after one round of pressure from the dragon, there's no healing required. Look at those HP numbers that Mauricio and Erebeth are at. Both are comfortable. Kyra might not spend her 2 actions healing them. Kyra might use those actions to cast Slow on the dragon again, or to cast a buff spell that makes the dragon easier to kill, or to just directly damage the dragon. So by simply using a reaction cleverly, the Guardian negated the need for healing for a round of combat that could have gone disastrously. Now, I do want to make it 100% clear. I did not account for hit rates when talking about this. The champion would have done a good job of making those crits less likely and making the follow-up hits less likely. It's not like the champion would have been a disaster on that battlefield. The champion would have done a good job tanking too. But here is where the power of the Guardian is coming through. When those -1s to enemy attacks and +1s to your friend's AC don't line up perfectly and the enemy just crits and or hits anyways, the champion is just left mitigating that damage. And that's still good. That still takes pressure off your party, but the Guardian can negate that pressure by turning off focus fire whenever needed. So with all of that, how good is Intercept Attack? Really? I think individually, singularly, it is the best tanking feature, feat, or spell in the game. Now, of course, a single feature does not a tank make. The whole class, when you compare it, when you compare Guardian, Champion, War Priest, Cleric, etc., the Guardian ends up looking like a very competent tank with a lot of good advantages offset by a few disadvantages, just like all of these other options. But Intercept Attack individually is just so obscenely powerful, and I think that's because unfocusing fire is just an excellent tool. You saw it in action on the previous 2 slides. Unfocusing fire makes a really big difference to how much pressure your party takes. And Intercept Attack is uniquely good at unfocusing enemy fire. We have unfocusing options in the game. Protector's Sacrifice, Share Life, Guardian's Aegis. You know what they all have in common? They transfer some of the damage to the person it's being transferred to. Intercept Attack transfers all of that damage. The only other option I could find that transfers all damage to a different target was Unexpected Transposition. If there are other options, please let me know. This is just the literal only one I could find other than Intercept Attack. And of course, this is a 6th rank spell, which means it's not even available till level 11 and not really spammable until much higher levels. Intercept Attack is available at level 1. It can be used every round of every combat in a day at level 1. At level 7, that becomes twice per round of every combat. So Intercept Attack is uniquely the best unfocusing fire tool. When you're playing a well-coordinated party, a GM usually only has one thing they can do to meaningfully threaten you in a vacuum: taking players out of the action economy. I say in a vacuum because secondary objectives can change this quite significantly, but let's ignore those for a second. In a combat, just a no-holds-barred combat between some monsters and some players, you really can only threaten the players if you're threatened to take them out of the action economy. This can look like Focus Fire to bring someone to 0 HP. This can look like advantageous terrain that forces the party to waste a lot of actions and resources navigating it. And this can look like directly using spells, features, etc. that incapacitate certain party members. Not necessarily the incapacitation trait, just something that takes a player out of combat up front. The Guardian simply being on the field turns off one of those 3 dimensions I talked about. Focus Fire stops being an option. You single-handedly take away an entire dimension of threat that the GM has for you, and the rest of your party can handle the rest of the threats the GM will throw at you. You took off a whole dimension of it, and that's precisely what a tank wants to do. So in the previous video, I talked about the types of tanking. There's mitigation tanks like the Champion, action denial tanks like the Monk, healing tanks like the War Priest Cleric, and spike damage tanks like the Sparkling Targe Magus. Where does the Guardian fall into these categories? I consider the Guardian its own category, the disruption tank. Your goal is to invalidate the enemy's tactics after they have committed actions to them, but notably without letting them have any value. So this is different than the other 4 types of tanks. Action denial and spike damage tanks, their goal is to prevent the enemy from taking those actions favorably, to make sure that you deny them good targets or just take them flat out of the action economy. Mitigation tanks and healing tanks will let the enemies do what they think is optimal, like say focus firing Mauricio in those previous slides, and then stem the bleeding while that's happening. Disruption tanks are able to invalidate this tactical option that the enemy took after they spent actions on it. In this regard, they're actually similar to caster-like reactions. Think of the wizard who likes to annoy the GM with Zephyr Slip. The enemy strides to the wizard Zephyr Slips away. Now the enemy kind of has no good option. They spent their action to stride already, but they didn't get to make a strike at the wizard. If they follow the wizard, they have fewer actions to strike with. If they go attack someone else, it was kind of a waste of time to come to the wizard in the first place. That's sort of what the Guardian does. The enemy wanted to focus fire Mauricio. The Guardian said no. Now the enemy can attack a full health Mauricio or a half health Guardian whom they're probably not going to hit. That's why I call the Guardian the disruption tank. And the disruption tank has a very sizable advantage over other tanks in that it can really help stem the worst case scenarios. In those scenarios where the enemy is rolling a little hot, getting crits and hits despite the fact that you had Shields of the Spirit up, and despite the fact that you used your reaction to reduce their attack, and despite the fact that you knocked them prone, if they're able to land all those hits and crits despite all the proactive options you took, you might be in a predicament, and somebody else in the party might have to spend actions healing someone. The Guardian is able to take this worst case scenario and just turn it off. Now, of course, sizable upsides come with their own downsides. What is the Guardian's downside as a tank? Well, the big downside is that you're not actually reducing the overall damage that the party is going to take. If on that previous slide, say the dragon was going to do around 75 points of damage in a round, the champion would have reduced that to somewhere in the 55 to 65 range, depending on if the resistance doubled up, how enfeebled stacked up, etc. The Guardian did not reduce the overall damage by that much. Its passive physical resist would have reduced the damage by 4, so you went from like 75 damage to 71. The overall damage a party takes with a Guardian there is still almost as high as it would have taken without a tank at all. The Guardian is redirecting damage, and while that is really good at disruption, that is not a good way of reducing your party's overall damage taken. When a Guardian is the primary tank of a party, the party needs to look at other ways of mitigating damage. Maybe the backline casters will stock spells like Hidebound. Maybe the Bard will pick Rallying Anthem rather than Courageous Anthem. Thinking about factors like that will help you mitigate the downside of being a Guardian. So this places the Guardian as a really powerful tanking option, right up there with the Champion, the Warperius Cleric, the Flurry of Maneuvers Monk. All of these are good tanks, and the Guardian is just another strong consideration to add to the list. And I find that awesome, because I think that out of all of these, the Guardian is definitely the flashiest of the tanks. It's also a really good option for somebody who wanted a champion-like playstyle but did not want the divine baggage. So the Guardian really earns its place as a class, and it's exceptional at tanking if you know what you're doing with it. And we have not yet talked about feats. And boy, does the Guardian get some awesome feats. Now I'll be showing off what I think are some of the cooler and flashier Guardian feats. First, let's get the obvious out of the way. The Guardian does have a line of feats to improve Taunt. You can increase the number of targets, the distance of your Taunt, you can compress it onto your strikes, etc. There are also many of the standard feats you would expect on a Marshal that's intended to tank. You have stuff like letting you raise a shield and move up. You of course have Reactive Strike. At level 18, you get a feat that quickens you with a unique restriction. And at level 20, you get some really cool passive boosts. I'll also note here that the Guardian Capstone feats, the level 20 ones, they're all passive boosts, which look a little boring on the surface, but they're very powerful options. But we're not here to talk about the feats that you would expect to see on the Guardian class, the standard Taunt upgrades, Marshal stuff. We're talking about the cool, thematic, fun feats to kind of showcase the kinds of play styles that you can build out of the Guardian. First, I wanted to talk about the Bodyguard feat. During your daily prep, you can choose a charge. Now, when your taunted enemy attacks this charge, the penalty is much bigger. It's -2 instead of -1. This is actually an excellent feat to have in situations like the one that I was showing in the slide earlier, where Ezrin was standing really far away from the party. If Ezrin was the Guardian's charge, the dragon would attack Ezrin with a -2 rather than a -1, and thus be fairly unlikely to crit. Alternatively, you might consider setting the charge to be your other frontline buddy. Maybe the party looks something like you and a squishy melee are in the front line, and then the back line is fairly self-sufficient. It's arcane primal casters. Like maybe there's an arcane and a divine caster that are able to take care of themselves at the back without much of your help. In that case, you would assign your frontline buddy as your bodyguard charge. So there's a lot of flexibility with this option, and it's a nice little way to change your party dynamics and help them adapt to your tanking style fairly easily by just spending a level 1 feat. Next up, I want to talk about Proud Nail. This is a flourish action, but it's a really good flourish action. If an enemy is off guard because they ignored the restrictions on your taunt, you can vicious swing them. You can power attack them for 1 action with flourish. Vicious swing is a decent feat at 2 actions because it's a good way to get a big spike of damage, to ignore resistance, or to kill low health enemies. At 1 action, it's just an incredible feat. This is also really good support for 2-handed weapon guardians. This was something that was a big concern in the playtest. In the playtest, it was fairly obvious that you should play a guardian with a shield and either an empty hand to grapple with or a weapon to deal damage with. 2-handed guardians did not get a lot of love, and Proud Nail goes against that and fixes the problem that was in the playtests. The damage you deal is based on your weapon damage die, so you're incentivized to use those D10 and D12 weapons, which are all 2-handed. And one notable thing is that the way Taunt is worded, simply electing to ignore the restriction is enough to make the enemy off guard to your taunt. You can intercept the attack they do, and they would still have the penalty. So let's say you're standing in the front line. The enemy focuses your friend. You intercept the attack for your friend, and then you still get to use Proud Nail on that enemy to punish them hard for daring to ignore the taunt you placed on them. And that is awesome. That is really thematic, and that is really powerful. It's always powerful to present the GM with dilemmas. The Guardian doesn't even really present the GM with an option. It just takes away the option and then punishes them for doing what they did anyways. Then there's Ring the Bell, yet another flourish option that is designed to punish people who ignored your taunt. It's a one-action flourish option that lets you make an attack against an enemy with your unarmed strike or your gauntlet, and if you hit, there's a save or they become stunned. The most comparable feat to this is the Fighter's Dazing Blow, which is a pretty good feat, but it has a prerequisite. It requires grabbing or restraining the enemy first. This prerequisite is much easier to fulfill. All you need to do is have an enemy who ignored your taunt in some capacity, and that's going to happen all the time because you're a pain to try and hit. Next up, my favorite Guardian feat, and candidate for like one of my top 5 favorite feats in the game, Juggernaut's Charge. And this, dear God, I love this feat so much. It's a 2-action option. You stride. If you're now within reach of an enemy, you can strike them. After the strike, you then get to stride again. And if your strike was a hit that dealt damage, the enemy is just dragged with you in the direction of your stride. This is such a good feat. First off, just add a baseline. This is 3 actions for the cost of 2 actions. As we all know, action compression is good, but it goes above and beyond that. It lets you drag an enemy with you. That is such a uniquely powerful utility that I don't think exists elsewhere in the game. There are plenty of force movement options in the game, but a lot of them just move enemies 5 to 10 feet at a time, and sometimes allow you to move with them. The biggest absolute number you can get for force movement is with Whirling Throw, which lets you throw enemies tens of feet away, but it requires you to grab them first, so it's inherently a little action intensive. Juggernaut's Charge is action compression that lets you move the enemy as much as your speed. If you have a 30-foot speed, you can move the enemy 30 feet in whatever direction you like if you hit them. For starters, this is a very cinematic feat, like getting to just hit someone, and the whirling tank that you are, you just kind of pin them on your armor and bring them with you. But aside from just being immensely thematic, this is also just really powerful and uniquely utilitarian. Let's say you're in the front line and there's one more frontliner. An enemy dives the back line. Now, for a normal tank, what happens here is the tank moves up there and tries to protect that friend, and then the other frontliner also has to move up there to try and attack that enemy, because the frontliner is probably a damage dealer for the party. You get to spend 2 actions in an action-positive manner to bring the enemy back. The reason I say this is action positive is because think about it. If you were not a Guardian, if you were a Barbarian and your goal was to bring the enemy back to the front line, you would have had to do this. Strike to the enemy, grab them, Whirling Throw them back to the front line, and then stride back to where they are in the front line. You get those 4 actions of value and a 5th action of value because you got to strike them and deal actual weapon damage as well. So you got 5 actions worth of value for 2, and you got to prevent your friend from having to spend an action to strike to that enemy. Insane amount of value. Honestly, a borderline broken amount of value. And it's not just to bring enemies out of the backline. You can do the reverse of this too. If at the start of combat, your whole party is bunched up, an enemy rushes up to you and now they're in everyone's face, you can Juggernaut's Charge them and pull them away from the backline. If the fight has been going on for a while and the other frontliner is looking really unhealthy, you can use the Juggernaut's Charge to reposition the enemy and create a new frontline that your friend doesn't have to retreat out of. If the enemy is occupying a choke point, you can take them out of the choke point. If you want to clear up a choke point for a friend to occupy, you can get yourself out of it, take away an enemy that would have potentially filled that space, and give your friend some time to come in. It's just such a good feat. These are the sorts of feats I love to pick on marshals. And finally, a level 16 feat that I wanted to show off just because the Guardian gets some awesome stuff at high levels, Clobber. It's a 2-action feat. Notably, it does not have Flourish. The Guardian does have a problem with a lot of its feats having the Flourish trait, but Clobber does not. You strike a foe, it deals an extra die of weapon damage. If you hit, you automatically shove the target, And then after being shoved, the target falls prone, not just on a crit success, even just on a regular success. So again, you got 3 actions for the value of 2, and a little bit of extra damage on one of those actions as well. This feels like a highly upgraded version of the fighter slam down feat. Honestly, I love it because again, quite cinematic and quite powerful. There are plenty of other awesome Guardian feats. These 5 are just the showcase I wanted to do to show off how cool and awesome this class is and how cinematic some of its options are. So that will be all for today's video, folks. I hope you enjoyed this look at the Guardian. I hope you're all as excited for the Guardian as I am, because boy, this class looks so awesome, and the next time I feel like playing a tank, I am 100% going to play a Guardian. Honestly, if the one-shot that happened on Swing Ripper's stream a couple weeks ago had happened now, I would have definitely played the Guardian in it and had so much fun with it. So that'll be all for today's video, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you can, please join a channel membership. It's a great way to directly support me without worrying about ads. As I mentioned at the start of this video, in the link, you're going to find a discount code to Magic Plus. And if you're at all interested in Team Plus content and awesome third-party content, and if you have any complaints about the Magic system in Pathfinder, please check it out. It is so awesome, and I had so much fun playtesting it, and you'll have a lot of fun playing it if you're able to play with third-party homebrew at your tables. Let me know if you're at all interested in the deep dive into Essence casting that I was thinking of doing, including a tactical breakdown of how it changes how casters play. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Mathfinder out.